Welcome, everyone, and I would first like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to present at this wonderful 2022 CARE conference. So my name is Jurian Hendrikse, and I'm a PhD candidate at Tilburg University, researching the real and capital market effects of firms' ESG performance. Today, I'm presenting a paper titled, "Are ESG ratings informative about companies' socially responsible behaviors abroad? Evidence from the Russian invasion of Ukraine." And this paper is joint work with Daniel Ahmed and Elisabeth de Meers from the University of Waterloo, Philip Joos, who is also at Tilburg University, and Baruch Lev from NYU. So as you are all likely very much aware of, on February 24th of this year, the Russian invasion of Ukraine started. In response to this invasion, leaders around the world and Western societies in particular were fast to condemn Russia's actions. In response to this public outcry about the invasion, firms were facing tough decisions on what to do with their Russian operations. Several firms were fast to respond and divest or suspend their Russian operations, with, for example, BP announcing on February 27th that it was going to divest its stake in the Russian state oil company Rosneft, and that it would take a $25 billion hit while doing so. Several other firms followed suit, such as the big luxury brands from France, but other firms weren't as fast to condemn the invasion or to take action, with, for example, the oil major Total deciding to stick with Russia despite the exit of many of its rivals. In addition, recently, Ukraine is accusing European and US banks over still having Russia-related links. All this shows that firms are facing considerable shareholder and stakeholder pressure about their Russian operations, and that several firms are taking billion-dollar hits in order to distance themselves from Russia. In other words, operating in Russia turned out to be a financially material ESG issue. However, even before the invasion, operating in Russia was not without its ESG risks and considerations. For example, when looking at the World Bank's worldwide governance indicators, one can see that Russia consistently performed in the bottom quartile of countries on voice and accountability, while Russia's control of corruption was perhaps even worse. And of course, its human rights violations and Putin's autocratic leadership style was widely reported upon in the popular press. At the same time, millions of investors and countless fund managers are investing based on environmental, social, and governance considerations, or based on ESG considerations. It is thus also not very surprising that the ESG ratings industry has become a billion-dollar industry, with ESG ratings providers claiming to measure companies' management of financially relevant ESG risks and opportunities, or to objectively measure a company's ESG performance, commitment, and effectiveness, and with such ratings agencies typically taking an industry-specific materiality approach in order to determine the most relevant ESG risks and ESG opportunities. So what do we do in our paper? Well, we use the Russian invasion of Ukraine to investigate whether such ESG ratings are informative of companies' socially responsible behaviors abroad. In particular, we ask whether more highly rated ESG firms are likelier to exert socially responsible behaviors before and after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We focus on European firms because these firms are most likely to be affected by the Russian invasion in a financially material way, and we collect data for all Stoxx 600 firms. The map on this slide shows the average Stoxx 600 firm Russia exposure based on their countries of headquarters, with bluer colors indicating higher levels of average exposure. The map indicates that firms' exposure to Russia is roughly proportional to the geographic proximity of its country of headquarters to Russia, with firms headquartered in Finland and Poland being comparatively the most exposed to Russia, as calculated based on the percentage of sales, net income, or employees from Russia. In our first set of analysis, we ask whether highly rated ESG firms were less likely to operate in Russia in the first place. in this analysis, we built upon the notion that operating in Russia wasn't without its ESG issues and ESG considerations even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The chart on this slide shows in blue the average ESG scores of firms with Russian exposure, and in orange the average ESG scores of firms without Russian exposure. We find that none of the ESG ratings providers assigned meaningfully lower ESG scores to firms with Russian exposure, whereas most strikingly, Refinitiv social and human rights scores were incrementally and significantly higher for firms with Russian operations than for firms without Russian operations, even though Russia was known for its human rights violations. In short, none of the ESG ratings providers captured the ESG risks and performance issues associated with firms' Russian operations. We next investigate whether, to the extent that highly rated ESG firms are operating in Russia, such firms are at least more fully informing investor and non-investor stakeholders about their Russian operations. We searched annual and sustainability reports before the invasion for Russia-related keyword hits, and we find that after controlling for several other determinants of disclosure, such as firm size or the materiality of firms' Russian exposure, that highly rated ESG firms were not incrementally transparent about their Russian operations, with many coefficient estimates being close to zero and some even being negative. We next investigate whether highly rated ESG firms are any faster to take meaningful action in response to the invasion. We all know that Russia has committed several atrocities and war crimes in Ukraine, with, for example, the indiscriminate mass shelling of civilian buildings or the Bucha massacre. We ask whether those firms that are alleged to be more caring about the social impacts of their operations are then any faster to take meaningful action in response to these atrocities. We define meaningful action as the number of days until a firm announces the withdrawal or suspension of its Russian operations, and we find that highly rated ESG firms were not any faster nor more likely to take meaningful action in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the atrocities committed afterwards. Now, in our last set of analysis, we investigate the stock market reaction to the Russian invasion. And in particular, there are often made claims that investing in highly rated ESG firms is doing well while doing good. And we put this to the test after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We construct hedge portfolios where we go long in firms that are in the top quartile of ESG ratings and short in firms that are in the bottom quartile of ESG ratings. And we find also in multivariate analysis controlling for many other determinants of stock returns that highly rated ESG firms significantly underperformed their lower rated counterparts. In addition, we find that those firms that we identified as having Russian exposure and also the materiality of that exposure was negatively related to stock returns, and those firms that were more transparent about their Russian exposure were facing additional losses. So, taken together, our results indicate that highly rated ESG firms were not less likely to operate in Russia, nor more likely to be transparent about such operations, that they were not faster nor more likely to take meaningful action in response to the Russian invasion and the subsequent atrocities and war crimes, and that shareholders in those firms were not better protected and even saw significantly lower stock returns after the outbreak of the war. Now, as such, our results provide considerable food for thought. ESG issues and performance considerations stemming from firms' international operations are not unique to operating in Russia. For example, Volkswagen recently faced union and shareholder calls surrounding human rights allegations in China, and executives are seeking briefings on Taiwan war risk, while many firms are facing important moral decisions on whether to be affiliated with Qatar's World Cup or with the sports washing in Saudi Arabia. Our results indicate that ESG ratings may not reflect such ESG consideration in firms' supply chains and international operations, and that highly rated ESG firms are not likely to more meaningful inform investors about the countries in which they operate and the ESG risks that stem from those operations. So thanks a lot, and thanks again to the conference organizers for asking me to speak.